Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the Weigh In Podcast. We are kicking things off with the men's divisions of Meet the Fighters with the flyweights, 125 pounds, the lightest weight class the men have to offer. Flyweight used to be one of the weaker weight classes in the UFC. And at one point, if you guys don't know the story, just to give you a little bit of background, Demetrius Johnson, the division's inaugural champion, went on a crazy run where he defended his title 11 times, a UFC record that still stands to this day. It was incredible watching DJ's greatness in the moment, but for some reason, he just really didn't connect with the fans, wasn't super marketable, and the division almost was eliminated. Henry Cejudo actually beat Demetrius Johnson to dethrone him, and Cejudo was set up with a super fight with the bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw. Dillashaw came down to 125 pounds, and if Dillashaw won, the division probably would have folded. The UFC began cutting the flyweights, but then Cejudo actually defeated TJ Dillashaw and essentially legitimized and saved the division. Fast forward to 2026, and this division is quickly becoming one of the most exciting in the UFC. It's one of my favorites to watch right now, and as you're about to find out, this division has a lot of incredible contenders and some really great fresh matchups to look forward to. So without further ado, let's kick things off with the 15th ranked contender in this division, one of the hotter prospects in the male divisions, especially in the lower weight classes, and it is England's Lanier Kavanagh. Kavanagh's 19-1 in his young career at just 26 years of age, an incredibly hyped and bright prospect. He has notable wins over Felipe dos Santos and Jose Ochoa. Did lose his last fight against Charles Johnson, but does have an upcoming fight against Bruno Silva in March, in which he will look to get back in the win column after his first professional loss. He is the former Rise of Champions amateur champion, won that title back in 2018 in his final amateur fight. He's well-rounded with exciting striking. He's very clean, very fast. A lot of the flyweights are extremely fast. And as I mentioned, he was undefeated in the first 9 fights of his career. Like I said, did suffer his first career loss in his last outing, but with that fight coming up against Bruno Silva, looking to get back on the horse. Despite the loss, Kavanagh is still a very hyped prospect with a lot of potential. I absolutely expect him to at least crack the top 10 at some point in his career. I always hate, dubbing these guys like future champions or future top fives this early, just because so much can happen in a career. I mean, injuries, losses can stack up. You just never know. But Lanier Kavanagh absolutely has the talent to get there. I would definitely safely predict him in the top 10 at some point in his career. Um, and it would not shock me by any means to see him holding a UFC title. It's just so early, and I've watched the sport long enough to know that you never deem a guy a future champion until he gets some really, really impressive wins. So Kavanagh, definitely a big prospect to keep an eye on heading into the new year, and that fight against Bruno Silva will be very important for him. Speaking of Bruno Silva, he is one spot ahead of Kavanagh in the rankings at number 14. Little confusing. If you go to Google him, there are 2 Bruno Silvas that competed in the UFC. One is Bruno Silva. His nickname is Blindado. He competed at middleweight. Bulldog is the flyweight Bruno Silva. 15-7-2 in his professional career with notable wins over Hyun Sung Park, Cody Durden, and Tyson Nam, although he has been in there with some of the flyweight elites. Joshua Van, Manel Kopp, Tagir Ulanbekov are his last 3 losses. He was the former World Fighting Federation flyweight champion, and at one point in his career, he suffered 2 straight losses in the UFC to David Dvorak and Tagir Ulanbekov. His next 4 fights would result in performance bonuses and wins before eventually being stopped by Manel Kopp. That ended his streak. Lost his next fight against Joshua Van, no shame there. But in his last outing in October, did get back on the horse with a win over Hyun Sung Park. He's very well rounded as well, can definitely hold his own in any realm. And his wins are very well spread out, 6 by TKO, 5 by sub, and 4 by decision. So majority of his wins do come by finish, and he does not discriminate on whether it's on the feet or on the ground. As I mentioned, he's got a very important fight for his career coming up against Lanier Kavanagh. He's fighting to keep his ranking, and if he loses to Kavanagh, there are a lot of very interesting prospects at 125 pounds that could very quickly take the place of the loser of that fight, so we'll see. But either way, a very important fight for Bruno Silva coming up. Now, coming up at number 13 is the guy that I previously mentioned beat Lanier Kavanaugh, and that is the 13th ranked Charles Johnson, the Energy, the last man to beat the current champion as well. Notable wins against Lanier Kavanaugh, Sumadarji, and the champ Joshua Van. He is the former LFA interim flyweight champion. He ended up defending that belt twice, and he would eventually vacate that title to come to the UFC. 18-7 in his professional career as well. He actually lost 4 of his first 6 UFC fights. He made his debut against Muhammad Makayev. No shame in that loss. And if Makayev was still in the UFC, he would absolutely be in the top 5, if not the champion. But that's a story for another day. I'll cover that at some point. But um, after that 2-6 run, he won 4 in a row before running into Ramazan Tamirov back in March of 25. But of course, that massive win over Lanier Kavanaugh, a knockout victory as well, and won a performance bonus for Charles Johnson, the biggest win. Oh, I guess I'd say second biggest win of his career, but of course, beating Joshua Van is very impressive and stopping Van as well. But Johnson himself has never been finished, despite having very good finishing instincts and very above average KO ability. 39% of his wins come by way of TKO. That is 7 of his 18 wins, 7 by decision and 4 by sub. So he definitely has some skills on the ground, but all of his losses have come by way of decision, never been finished inside the distance. He's got an important fight of his own coming up on January 24th at UFC 324, the first card of the year against Alex Perez. Very important fight for Charles Johnson. He wants to keep climbing the rankings. Coming in at number 13, or I'm sorry, coming in at number 12, pardon me. The first Dagestani that we have covered in these rankings, and if you're a hardcore of the sport, you know throughout every single weight class, there's probably at least one Dagestani somewhere in there. For the newer fans, Dagestan, this region in Russia, is a region you're going to want to get very familiar with. We meet the first one of the Meet the Fighter series, and that is the number 12 ranked flyweight Tagir Ulanbekov. Now, the reason Dagestan is so significant to the newcomers, that is where Habib Nurmagomedov is from, the man who beat Conor McGregor in the biggest MMA fight of all time. And plenty of fighters have continued to come from that region, and especially that camp that has just surged into the MMA mainstream and a very popular place for a lot of high-level fighters. But for Tagir, he is 17-3 in his career, a pretty impressive record. Notable wins over Azat Maxim, which that win, I believe, will age phenomenally. Cody Durden, Nate Manis, Bruno Silva, and Asu Almabayev. That win has aged gracefully as well. Former Fight Nights Global and Guerrilla Fighting flyweight champion outside the UFC. Has competent striking, however, he definitely prefers to take the fight to the ground. 47% of his wins do come by way of submission, only 1 by way of strikes, and then the other 6 by way of decision. Unfortunately, he has pulled out of 8 fights in his UFC career, and that has been a very big criticism of Tagir Ulanbekov. Missed weight a couple times as well, which has caused fights to be canceled, but really just needs to stay healthy and make it to the octagon. That seems to be one of his biggest battles in his UFC career. He is coming off a loss to Kyoji Horiguchi in his last fight. That was a very important fight for him, and especially at 34 years old and being in the lighter weight classes, that really seemed like a must-win if Tagir wanted to continue his championship aspirations. Horiguchi, of course, not a loss to be ashamed of at all. We'll get to him in a moment, but definitely a win that he really, really needed, and it would have skyrocketed him in the flyweight rankings, I believe. But just a rough night at the office. Horiguchi beat him down and ended up choking him out in the 3rd round. So it'll be interesting to see what's next for Ulanbekov. I don't personally think he's going to be able to get to the championship just because of his age and, like I said, has had a couple of tough losses, but still definitely an interesting talent. He's a talented fighter and fun to watch, but we'll see what's next for him in 2026. Maybe he can get a higher ranked opponent and get a big win. Now, coming in at number 11, we have a former title challenger for the flyweight title all the way back in, I believe, 2020, and that was Alex Perez. He is 25-10 in his mixed martial arts career with notable wins over Matthews Nicolau and Jussier Formiga. Some throwback wins there for the OGs. Former Tachi Palace Fights flyweight champion way back in his early days before the UFC. And another guy that really just struggles to make it to the cage. He's pulled out of 9 fights 14 failed bookings altogether, so 9 were because of him, 5 were because of the opponent pulling out, and he has had a really, really rough run as of late. He won 6 of his first 7 UFC fights before challenging Davison Figueiredo for the championship, and he is 1-5 in his last 6 since. He does have a pretty well-rounded skill set. He doesn't really discriminate. 6 wins by KO or TKO, 7 by sub, and 12 by decision. But just had a really rough last few years. I'm kind of surprised he's still in the rankings, to be completely honest with you. And he's kind of got a prove-it fight coming up against Charles Johnson that he has to win. If he loses that fight, he'll be 1-6 in his last 7. And honestly, I don't think he'd be in the UFC anymore. I think he would probably get cut if he loses that fight. So a must-win fight coming up for Alex Perez if he wants to keep his ranking and likely spot in the UFC. Now that brings us to cracking the top 10, and we meet another former title challenger, and that is the Aussie Astro Boy Steve Erceg. Erceg is 13-4 in his MMA career. Solid notable wins against Ode Osborne and Matt Schnell. Outside the UFC, he was the eternal MMA flyweight champion. He did defend that title once. And he's also won 2 performance bonuses in the UFC, has actually become known for some heavier hands inside the UFC, despite the fact that majority of his wins have come by submission. 46% of his wins on the ground, but has really developed his striking since coming to the UFC. However, it has kind of got exposed a little bit. He was knocked out by Kai Kara France 3 fights ago and lost to Brandon Moreno as well. Did get back on the horse with a win against Ode Osborne in 2025 back in August. So a very big win for Steve Erceg after dropping 3 in a row. But that losing streak did begin with a title challenge against Alexandre Pantoja. And that fight was actually incredibly close. For as great as Pantoja is, Erceg took him to the limit and nearly beat him. So Steve Erceg, he's still young too. He's only 30 years old. So despite being 1-3 in his last 4, he is still a name to keep an eye on, has a lot of room to grow, and I absolutely believe he could work his way back up the division very quickly. Coming in at number 9, we have an OG of the flyweight division. And for you hardcore fans, you love watching this guy fight. You know exactly who I'm talking about. One of the most awkward fighters in the UFC. It is Tim Elliott. Elliott is 21-13-1 in his professional career with notable wins over Kai Asakura, Suma Darji, Tagir Ulanbekov, and yes, you see that name right. That is Jens Pulver, the former UFC lightweight champion, the inaugural lightweight champion, as a matter of fact. And Tim Elliott actually holds a win over him, which is just crazy. When I was looking at his record, I almost didn't believe it. But it was back in 2011 at bantamweight. Jens Pulver at that point dropped all the way down to 135 pounds. Weight cutting, of course, had been introduced between the time that Pulver was the lightweight champion and 2011. Ended up beating him with a knee. That was back in RFA at RFA 1. Made his UFC debut 2 fights later against John Dodson. He was the former Titan FC flyweight champion that was in between UFC stints. For those who don't know the story, Tim Elliott was in the UFC as a flyweight and was cut. A little bit later on, a couple years later, they did an Ultimate Fighter season to determine the next title challenger for Demetrius Johnson. So they took 16 flyweight champions outside the UFC, included guys like Brandon Moreno and Alexandre Pantoja. Kai Kara France was on that season, just to name a few. And Titan FC's Tim Elliott. Elliott ended up winning the show and challenging Demetrius Johnson for the title. Had a couple moments too and nearly caught Demetrius Johnson in a submission. Ended up losing that fight, but he can say he challenged Demetrius Johnson for the flyweight title, which is incredibly impressive. High-level submission ability as well with very awkward striking. And that submission ability was put on display when he did submit Kai Asakura in his last fight with a guillotine. Very impressive win. Asakura very accomplished outside the UFC. So Tim Elliott, despite being a wily veteran and 39 years old, still kicking it with the youngsters and winning fights in the UFC. So shout out to Tim Elliott, one of the incredible pioneers of the flyweight division in the UFC. Coming in at number 8, we have a little bit of a flyweight legend, kind of outside the UFC. He was in the UFC 9 years ago, got cut, was incredibly successful over in Japan and Ryzen, and then eventually in Bellator as well. now back in the UFC, and I am so excited he's back. That is the Japanese phenom Kyoji Horiguchi. Horiguchi is an incredible 35-5 in his MMA career, a long notable wins list as well. He beat Tagir Ulanbekov, Sergio Pettis, Makoto Shinryu, Kai Asakura, Darian Caldwell twice, Ian McCall, Shintaro Ishiwatari twice, Manel Kopp, and Ali Bagautinov way back in his first UFC stint. As I mentioned, incredibly successful in Ryzen and Bellator, holding both bantamweight champions. Currently on a 6-fight unbeaten streak as well. His last loss came against Patchy Mix back in Bellator in 2022. Lost back-to-back fights against Sergio Pettis and Patchy Mix. That Sergio Pettis loss, a fight he was winning, and Pettis just landed a picture-perfect spinning back fist for the win. He did avenge that loss in 2024 as well in Ryzen. Had one more win and then was re-signed by the UFC. Made his UFC return against Tagir Ulanbekov in his last outing in November and won with a rear naked choke. Incredibly impressive. He also did have a UFC title shot back in his first stint in the organization, and his only UFC loss was actually that challenge against Demetrius Johnson. He was armbarred in the 5th round with 1 second left on the clock, still remains tied for the latest finish in UFC history. He won 13 fights in a row after that before running into Kai Asakura in 2019 in Ryzen. He's got a massive fight on the books scheduled to fight Amir Albazi on February 7th. And if he wins that fight, Kyoji Horiguchi would definitely be on the short list for a UFC title shot. However, Flyweight is incredibly stacked at the top right now. Just add Kyoji Horiguchi to the mix. Really, the winner of that fight is just right there in the mix with the best of the best at Flyweight. The title picture at 125 is so exciting right now, and I'm so happy to have Kyoji Horiguchi back in the UFC and in the title picture. Coming in at number 7, another very impressive up-and-comer, and that is Kazakhstan's Asu Almabayev. Very impressive record for him. He's 23-3 in his MMA career. Some good notable wins over Alex Perez, Matthews Nicolau, and Ode Osborne. He's the former M1 Global Interim Flyweight Champion and the former NYSA FC Undisputed Flyweight Champion. He did suffer his first 2 career losses all the way back in 2017. One was actually to Tagir Ulanbekov. That was his first professional loss. Lost again to Mamen Mamedov, and then won his next 17 fights in a row, all the way up to his first UFC loss against Manel Kopp. And of course, that loss to Manel Kopp is not a bad loss at all. He is elite grappling and loves the rear naked choke. 10 of his 23 wins are by way of submission, just 3 TKOs. And he is a very interesting contender to watch at 125 pounds, making his way up. After that loss to Kopp, bounced back with wins over Jose Ochoa and Alex Perez. And he has the biggest fight of his career coming up to this point, scheduled against Brandon Moreno on February 28th. So if he can get through Brandon Moreno, he will be firmly inside the top 5. Asu Almabayev, I believe, is going to be a big name to watch in this division in 2026. Now coming up on our last fighter outside the top 5, another incredible up-and-coming talent, just 32 years old in this division, and that is Iraq's Amir Albazi, the Prince. He is 17-2 in his MMA career, notable wins over the former title challenger Kai Kara France, Francisco Figueiredo, that is Davison's brother, and Jalga Shumagulov. He's the former UC MMA and Fight Star Bantamweight champion, dropped to Flyweight upon entering the UFC. He won his first 11 professional fights before eventually running into Jose Torres back in Brave CF. Jose was a double champ there, so not a loss to be ashamed of at all. He is another flyweight that just has not really been able to stay healthy. He's at 8 fight cancellations inside the UFC, and unfortunately did lose the biggest fight of his career against Brandon Moreno. It was a unanimous decision loss back in November of 2024. And we did not see him compete inside the UFC in 2025. He did have a grappling match in December of 2025, but did finally get a fight on the books. And it's a big one against Kyoji Horiguchi on February 7th. That is the first fight night card of the year. We, of course, have UFC 324 on January 24th. 325 on January 31st, and then the first UFC Fight Night on February 7th, and that is where he will be taking on Kyoji Horiguchi. That is the co-main event of that fight night, headlined by Mario Batista and Vinicius Oliveira. So, Amir Albazi with one of the biggest fights in the flyweight division in the first half, probably first quarter, I should say, of 2026. And of course, if he gets that win, he is right there in the thick of the flyweight title picture. Now we crack the elite, the true elite of 125 pounds, kicking things off at number 5. And we have the former champion, one of the most beloved fighters in the entire sport, and that is the assassin baby, Brandon Moreno, the former champion of the flyweights. 23-9-2 in his career with notable wins over Steve Erceg, Amir Albazi, Davison Figueiredo twice, Kai Kara France twice, and Brandon Royval, a series in which him and Royval traded wins and losses. They fought twice. Each Brandon won, one apiece. As I mentioned, he is the former two-time UFC flyweight champion and the former LFA and WFF flyweight champion. He defended the WFF title 3 times. And of course, the LFA championship does have a story behind it. Just like I mentioned with Tim Elliott, Moreno actually was or was he the LFA champion? Yes, he was. He was. My apologies. Had a little bit of a brain fart there. Moreno was the LFA champion at the time of the Ultimate Fighter filming. He was actually in the UFC and was cut. He fought in a main event against Sergio Pettis and lost that. Then fought Alexandre Pantoja and lost that fight. And that was around the time they were purging the flyweights. Pantoja ended up getting cut as well. Moreno among so many others. And then they brought him back on The Ultimate Fighter. He was competing as one of the outside the UFC champions for the flyweight division. Had he won that show, he would have gotten the title shot against Demetrius Johnson, but he did not. He actually ended up losing to Alexandre Pantoja on the show, but got back in the UFC, went on a credible run, and ended up winning the championship against Davison Figueiredo. They drew in the first matchup, and he won the rematch to claim the flyweight title, lost the third fight, won the fourth. The only quadrilogy in UFC history, Brandon Moreno was on the other side of it against Davison Figueiredo. He does have 7 UFC performance bonuses as well, one of the most exciting fighters in the history of the flyweight division, and a massive fight coming up for him against Asu Almabayev. Moreno had won 2 in a row before running into Tatsuro Taira on December 6th of 2025. Might have been a little bit of an early stoppage, but it's hard to say that Moreno really could have done a lot to change that position. He still seemed with it when he got up, so maybe let that fight go a little bit longer, but this kind of seems like a prove-it fight for Brandon Moreno. Coming off that loss against Tyra to go up against another up-and-comer, if he loses that fight, it will sadly probably kind of knock him outside the title picture. He'll still be one of the best at 125 pounds and a very tough out. But in terms of championship hopes, if he wants to regain his title, that's going to be one that he's going to need to win. Now, that fight against Tyra was the first time he'd ever been finished in his MMA career, so a tough pill to swallow for Moreno. Looking for a quick turnaround against Asu Almabayev to get back on the horse. Now, coming in at number 4, we have a former title challenger and the other Brandon at the top of the flyweight division, and that is the Raw Dog, Brandon Royval, one of the most fun fighters at the top of this division. 17-9 in his pro MMA career with notable wins over Tatsuro Taira, which that win has aged like a fine wine. Brandon Moreno, Matthews Nicolau, Kai Kara France, and the incredibly difficult Tim Elliott. He was also a former LFA flyweight champion and the former kickdown amateur champion way back in the day. He was undefeated in his amateur career as well in 5 fights. 6-time performance winner in the UFC, and the most notable was the 2025 Fight of the Year. At least I believe it was Fight of the Year against Joshua Van. If you have never seen that fight, it was very, very recent in June of 2025. Go watch that fight. That is one of the greatest 3-round fights you will ever see. Knock him down, drag him out, slobber knocker war. Just an incredible watch. And if you're looking to get someone into MMA and the UFC, that is one of the fights that you'd want to show them. So if you're a new or even an OG, I mean, it never hurts to go watch that fight back. It was so much fun. Go watch it. He did challenge for the UFC title as well, went on a 3-fight win streak before challenging Alexandre Pantoja for the title. Did lose that fight via unanimous decision. That was his second loss to Pantoja. But Brandon Royval is still one of the most fun fighters to watch. Did lose that fight of the year to Joshua Van, and then eventually was finished by Manel Kopp in the final fight of 2025. So unfortunate couple fights for Brandon Royval in 2025. Did not necessarily have the best year, but I would, after that knockout loss to Manel Kopp, I would probably like to see him take the first half of 2026 off just to kind of heal up a little bit and come back in the second half against, maybe an up and comer, maybe someone around the 5 to 10 range. But in the meantime, Brandon Royval still one of the most fun fighters in the division and ranked at number 4. Coming in at number 3, and this is a guy that is very well in the mix for the next title fight. And there's talks of maybe potentially doing a title fight with him and the champion in his home country of Japan, and that is the Phenom Tatsuro Taira. Taira 18-1 in his MMA career with notable wins over Brandon Moreno, Hyung Sung Park, and Alex Perez. He is the former Shudo Flyweight champion and was undefeated as an amateur, winning 2 Shudo amateur titles as well. He was actually 9-0 as an amateur, so a pretty decorated amateur career. You don't really see a lot of longer amateur careers. His only career loss was a split decision loss to Brandon Royval, a fight of the night back in October of 2024. Very close fight that some people did argue that Taira won. Came back with a vengeance, face cranked Hyun Sung Park, just a vicious submission to begin his 2025. That was all the way in August, so missed the first half of 2025, but a great comeback win. And then, of course, the biggest win of his career over Brandon Moreno at UFC 323. And now Taira knocking on the door of a title fight. The title picture is a little bit murky, and I'll explain a little bit more as we get to the number 1 contender and the champion, but Tatsuro Taira definitely going to be in the mix for the next title fight. And I would absolutely not be upset if he gets it. And if they did that fight in Japan at the Tokyo Dome or the Saitama Super Arena or something like that, that would just be insane. The Japanese MMA scene has really taken a hit since the 2000s. I would love to see it revived with a fight like that in Japan. Coming in at number 2, and he might be the only fighter in the contenders list that is hotter than Tatsuro Taira at the moment, and that is the scorching white hot Manel Kopp of Portugal. Starboy, a very fitting nickname for Manel Kopp. He is 22-7 in his MMA career with some very good notable wins over Brandon Royval, Asu Almabayev, Bruno Silva, Felipe Dos Santos, Jalga Zhumagulov, and Kai Asakura in Ryzen. He is the former Ryzen bantamweight champion, and he actually won that title against Kai Asakura before coming to the UFC. He vacated that title to make his UFC debut. Actually lost his first 2 UFC fights against Alexandre Pantoja, no shame there, and Matthews Nicolau in his next fight. And he has since gone on a 7-1 run with his only loss coming against Muhammad Makayev. He's won 3 performance bonuses in his UFC career and has very heavy hands. His last fight, that knockout against Brandon Royval, was just absolutely vicious, and he finished Asu Almabayev as well, which when I talked about Almabayev, I talked about how impressive he was and how promising he looks. Manel Kopp finished him. I mean, Kopp is just on an incredible run in the UFC. Got off to a little bit of a slow start, had some weight miss issues as well, but has really taken off since the loss to Muhammad Makayev. 3 straight wins, 3 straight knockouts. Absolutely deserving of a title fight. And whether they give it to him or Tatsuro Taira, I don't think either is a bad option. I don't think anybody would be upset with either of them getting a title shot over one another. Both are just so incredible. Both coming off statement wins. It's honestly tough to determine who you even give it to. It might just come down to whoever's the most available whenever the UFC and the champion is ready. However, there is a big old monkey wrench that you throw into the title picture, and that is the health of the number 1 contender, which, of course, is the former champion, the second greatest flyweight of all time, the cannibal Alexandre Pantoja. Pantoja is 30-6 in his MMA career with an incredible notable wins list. Kai Kara-France twice, Kai Asakura, Steve Ercek, Brandon Royval twice, Brandon Moreno 3 times, and with the accomplishments I listed for Moreno, you see how impressive that is. Alex Perez, Manel Kopp, and Matt Schnell. Now, he is the former UFC flyweight champion. He had 4 title defenses in his reign, but a little bit of an asterisk, which obviously isn't on the screen, but a mental asterisk that I have by his record. Because his last fight, he was the champion going in, and it was maybe 30 seconds in. He threw a kick. His opponent caught it, took him down, and when Pantoja landed, he dislocated his elbow as he tried to brace himself for the fall, and the fight was over there. So he, as you see there, did lose his UFC title due to an arm injury. So that's kind of the reason the title picture is a little bit murky, because you could have Tatsuro Taira get the shot, you could have Manel Kape get the shot, but with the nature of the loss for Alexandre Pantoja, whenever he comes back, he's going to get the title shot. So it all depends on his health. If he is healthy and ready to go when the champion's ready, Alexandre Pantoja will be fighting for the title again. If he's not ready to go, it will be either Manel Kape or Tatsuro Taira. Now, my wish is if Pantoja's ready to go and he can get the next title shot, which I really hope he can come back quick. You never want to see a guy lose due to a freak injury like that. But if Pantoja's ready to go, you've got to do Manel Kape versus Tatsuro Taira. Do a fight night main event in Japan. Screw it. Do Manel Kape versus Tatsuro Taira in Japan, and do Alexandre Pantoja and Joshua Van's rematch. Kape and Taira in Japan as a main event for a fight night would be humongous. Taira is, of course, Japanese. Manel Kape fought in Ryzen, so he's already competed in that region. You got to make that fight. But back to Pantoja. Former RFA flyweight champion, and that was what got him on to the Ultimate Fighter, that champion season that I talked about. He ended up beating Brandon Moreno while on the show and would eventually lose to Hiromasa Uegikubu. I cannot say that name. My sincerest apologies. I watched that season and I really don't even remember that, to be completely honest with you. Just goes to show how notable that was, right? Did get back into the UFC from there, won his first 2 before losing to Dustin Ortiz. Won 3 in a row and then lost to the future champion Davison Figueiredo. Went 1-1 in his next 2 and then would end up winning his next 8, which included winning the title off of Brandon Moreno. Defended it 4 times against Brandon Royval, Steve Erceg, Kai Asakura, and Kai Kara France. And it just seemed like Alexandre Pantoja got better with every single title defense. His first couple defenses, his fight with Brandon Moreno to win the title was super close. Beat Royval pretty comfortably, but it was still kind of a dogfight. Steve Erceg took him to the limit, and then Pantoja began to dominate. And that was why his fight against Joshua Van was so hyped. It sucked that it ended that way. So I really hope Alexandre Pantoja is healthy and can come back really soon, because I would love to see him and Van run it back. But speaking of Joshua Van, that does bring us to the current champion, the reigning, defending, undisputed UFC flyweight champion of the world, the fearless Joshua Van of Myanmar. He is 16-2 in his MMA career and incredibly young. We'll get to that in just a second. Notable wins for him, of course, Alexandre Pantoja, the Fight of the Year win against Brandon Royval, Bruno Silva, Ray Saruya, Cody Durden, and Zhalgas Zhumagulov. He is the former Fury FC flyweight champion, both in the pro and amateur ranks. And crazy fact about him, he's only 24 years old, born on October 10th, 2001. He is the first fighter from the 2000s to challenge for a UFC championship, let alone win one, and the second youngest champion in the entire history of the UFC, only behind John Jones, who, of course, won his first title at 23. I already mentioned on Brandon Royval's slide, but the 2025 Fight of the Year between Joshua Van and Brandon Royval, again, go watch it. You're not going to be disappointed. But Joshua Van, as I mentioned, won the title in a bit of a freak way. I mean, technically, if you really want to look at it, he did catch the kick and dump Pantoja. When Pantoja went to brace, his arm snapped. Of course, that's not necessarily like Joshua Van breaking his arm and winning the title, but if Joshua Van doesn't catch that kick and take Pantoja down, that does not happen. So I feel like the fans are being a little bit tough on Joshua Van. He celebrated after the fight, and a lot of people didn't like that. Personally, for me, I mean, he's 24 years old. He technically just won the UFC title. And again, you don't want to win that way, but If he does not catch the kick and take him down, that doesn't happen. So Van at least had a hand in it. Of course, that's not really enough to comfortably say that you're the better fighter on the night, but I feel like fans are being a little bit hard on him, to be completely honest. But either way, whether you're hard on him and believe that he shouldn't have celebrated, or whether you're like, no, celebrate, it doesn't matter because he's going to get in the cage in a little bit and he's going to fight, and we're going to find out. He has to rematch Alexandre Pantoja at some point. If he doesn't, it's going to be either Tatsuro Taira and Manel Kopp, and we're going to find out, right? We are going to see those guys get in the cage, and we're going to find out whether Joshua Van is a legit champion or not. But as of now, he is the one holding the title, the fearless Joshua Van, the champion of the flyweights. I love this division, and I am so excited for 2026. Flyweight, I believe, is one of the top divisions in the UFC right now. It is just absolutely loaded. 2026 has the potential to be the biggest year in the history of the flyweight division. So you're going to want to tune into 125 pounds this year because 2026 is going to be just insane for the flyweights. One of the biggest blockbuster years that 125 pounds has ever had. But thank you guys so much for tuning into another episode of Meet the Fighters. The bantamweights, 135 pounds, are coming up next in the next episode. I am hoping to get that uploaded tomorrow night. In the meantime, I hope you guys have a blessed one. Stay safe. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.